had a lot of fun doing the episode ranking for my favorite Attack on Titan episodes, so I really wanted to do a similar video on another show. And I felt Arcane was a very good show to do it for. Not only is it one of the best shows I've seen in the past few years, but due to the short length of it, I'll be able to go into more detail about each episode and why this is such an amazing show. So I'll be giving my thoughts on each episode of the show so far, and I'll give them each a score based on how much I enjoyed them. Anyways, let's get into it. Episode 1. Welcome to the Playground. The first episode of Arcane, although not bad, was definitely my least favorite, and it had me worried if I was going to like this show or not, although it does have things that it does very well. The opening scene was haunting, and was probably the best part of the episode. It really shows how terrible war can be and the emotional toll it can take on people. It also gives us a great introduction to Vander's character. The first scene we see of him is him killing an enforcer, but then he comes across Vi and Powder, who showed him how much suffering war can cause to people even if they aren't directly involved in it. So for this reason, he chooses to discard his gauntlets and chooses to take Vi and Powder with him. The scene shows how good this show is with visual storytelling, giving us all this important information with barely any dialogue. We also get introduced to Zaun, which was set up really well. The establishing shots of it giving us such a good feel of the atmosphere of this place and what the inhabitants of it are like. The introduction scene with Silco, although well directed, gives off the impression that he's a pretty two-dimensional villain. But then again, it made the show adding depth to his character later on all the more impressive. I think what brought this episode down for me was the premise and characters feeling a little bit generic, and I never would have imagined how much more interesting the rest of this show would be. I'll give the episode a 6.5, since although there's good things about it, it felt a little bit too uneven for me to give it a higher score. Although I appreciate it more on rewatch, it's still by far the weakest episode for me. Episode 2. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. From here on out, every episode of this show is much better. I didn't think too strongly of this episode on my first viewing, but just like the rest of Arcane, it just gets better with every rewatch. Right off the bat, this episode shows how decisions have massive and permanent consequences in this show, showing how the robbery done by Vi and her group has led to everything in Jace's life going terribly wrong. This episode does such a great job at introducing us to Jace's character, using this low point in his life to explore what motivates him to pursue his goals. So it's pretty sad to see how he loses so much he cared about all because no one believed in him, and to see how this affects him so much that he considers taking his own life. But before he can do this, he's stopped by Victor, who chose to meet with Jace since he thought there's a lot of potential for Jace and his ideas. And he could also empathize with Jace's struggles of feeling like they're not appreciated enough. It makes it easy to see how these two grew so close, being the only people who could truly understand each other for the first time in their lives. We also get introduced to the Council, who will have a lot of significance on the story from here. The Council member who is fleshed out most in this episode being Heimerdinger. He admittedly comes across as a bit annoying, but it definitely felt intentional, and I still think he's a decent character. His negative views of magic are very understandable due to him witnessing the negative effects of magic firsthand, something which contrasts Jace witnessing magic used to save the lives of himself and his mother. And all of this is without mentioning the storyline in Zaun, which I felt became a lot more interesting in this single episode, as we see many of the people in Zaun wanting to fight back against the enforcers who have been causing trouble for them due to the recent robbery in Piltover. It once again shows how Vi's choice to rob Jace's house has had massive consequences that are just getting worse as the show continues. We get a lot of great moments with Vander as we see him struggle to solve the current conflict with Zaun. He wants for all of this to be solved peacefully, but the people in Zaun are tired of being treated terribly by enforcers and want to fight back, thinking that it'll solve all their problems. But Vander knows better than anyone that violence won't solve problems and just create more of them. This entire conflict puts on display one of this show's most important themes: how as long as there are people, conflict will always exist to some extent. Whether it's for good reasons or bad, there will always be people there to perpetuate it. I feel this was the first episode to show one of the most impressive parts about Arcane, which is how densely written it is. There's so many characters, plot lines, and themes to be covered in a single episode, yet it conveys all of them so well without suffering any pacing issues. It's such an impressive piece of storytelling, and the fact that the show only gets better from here is what makes it easy to see why Arcane is truly incredible. I'll give this episode a 9.4 out of 10. Episode 3. The base violence necessary for change. Just from the opening scene, I could tell this episode was going to be something special. And once this episode had ended, any doubts I previously had about this show were erased. These past 2 episodes have shown many times how actions have consequences, and it's in this episode where we see how terrible said consequences can be. This episode isn't all bad things happening though. The storyline with Jace and Victor was very entertaining, and to see them finally prove themselves to the council was a really satisfying moment. But other than that, there's close to no moments of joy to be found in this episode, where many of the characters we've been following in Zaun are either killed off or witness some truly terrible events that will scar them forever. We also get a lot of information about Silco's character, learning what motivates him to do the terrible things he does, along with how Vander's violent past shapes Silco into the person he is in the present, and is the reason for so many bad things that happen in this show. And this all ties into the absolutely tragic conclusion of Vander's character arc. He wanted to resolve the conflict with Piltover peacefully by turning himself in, but we see his past violent acts come back to haunt him when Silco attacks, showing that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the consequences of his past actions. And the fact that he had to resort to violence to save those he cares about, only for him not being able to save everyone, makes his death so much sadder. It's one of the many aspects of this episode that took this show in a much darker direction than I would have expected. We then get another one of the darkest developments of the show, where Powder's attempts to help out her friends actually interferes with said friends' plans, indirectly leading to the deaths of Milo, Clagger, and Vander. She's just a child who's thrown into a terrible situation, and now this horrific mistake she made will haunt her for the rest of her life. And if that wasn't enough, Vi learning that Powder did this leads to her leaving her little sister behind. You can't blame Vi here, since she's rightfully distraught after those she cared about were indirectly killed by her own sister. But in the end, Powder was just a child who didn't really know what she was doing, and for that reason they both lost everyone they cared about. It's yet another tragic part of this episode that left me feeling so horrible for these 2 characters. And if all these emotions weren't enough, we get one of the most surprising and powerful moments of the show, where we see Silco and Powder hug. We see in this episode how ruthless Silco is in the pursuit of his goals, even being able to stab the person he once cared about the most. Yet we see him show empathy towards Powder, who similar to himself felt betrayed by the person they cared about so much. It's a very humanizing moment that showed a more vulnerable side to this absolutely terrible person, and it made me view Silco's character in such a different light as the show goes on. There are few moments I can recall watching a show that have left me feeling genuinely speechless, and the ending of this episode was one of them. It didn't end with a big reveal or anything, but with the bleakest outlook possible. This episode had so much tragedy and sadness that it could have felt too contrived. Yet it was all built up too masterfully, and they hit every emotional note perfectly. And in the end, I was left in both heartbreak and awe of what I just watched. Even long after I've watched this episode, I'm still having trouble putting into words how good it is. I haven't seen shows that are multiple seasons long reach the level of emotional impact this show does in 3 episodes, and was more than enough to convince me that I was in for something truly special. This is a 10 out of 10 episode without a doubt. Episode 4, Happy Progress Day. I don't have as much to say about this episode compared to other episodes. It just does a great job at catching the viewers up on what happened during the time skip, and introducing new issues for the characters to deal with now that so much has changed. We see how Jace and Victor's technological advancements have progressed Piltover significantly, but also they're feeling dissatisfied with how slow Hex tech is progressing, due to Heimerdinger not being as willing to embrace this technology as quickly as they do. But it's hard to dislike him for it, since he knows better than anyone how negative the effects of magic can be. But at the same time, he's holding back Jace and Victor from using this technology to help people as soon as possible. We also get plenty of scenes with Jinx in this episode, which I found the most interesting. They were pretty entertaining, and I do enjoy their character, but it was also really sad to see how much they've changed, where they're not only taking enjoyment from killing people, but is constantly haunted by her past in the form of hallucinations. But it made sense why this change was so significant, as she was shaped by their immense trauma and guilt from the events of the previous episode. And at the end of the episode, we finally see Vi for the first time since the time skip. And in such a short time, we get a feeling of how different she seems compared to how we knew her before the time skip. And it left me interested to see more of her character. I'll give this episode a 9.4 out of 10. Episode 5, Everybody Wants to Be My Enemy. Although I enjoyed the previous episode, it did slow down the pace a bit in order to set up all the change that has happened in this world. But this episode really makes up for it and gives us plenty of fantastic moments for all the important storylines in this show. I really enjoyed the storyline with Jace in this episode, as we see him struggle to choose if he should be putting the people of Piltover over his own goals. It shows how although Jace does have good intentions, he's also slightly driven by his ego and ambition, which can get in the way of choosing to do the right thing. I also like seeing more Vi in this episode. It makes it clear not only how terrible prison was for her, but how the guilt of her leaving Powder behind has been weighing down on her ever since before the time skip. So it makes a lot of sense why she has changed so much in only a few years. Also, I absolutely love the scenes with her and Caitlyn. They have such great chemistry, and I love seeing how their relationship developed in this one episode. My favorite parts of this episode were once again the scenes with Jinx, as we see her continue to struggle with her guilt and trauma. Especially the scene with the boxing machine was very impactful, showing the resentment and jealousy she feels towards Vi, which shows how much more complex their views of each other have become, leaving me interested in seeing their eventual reunion. Also, her relationship with Silco did a great job at continuing to humanize Silco's character, showing how he genuinely cares about Jinx and appreciates her for who she is. This episode also gives us some great set pieces to keep things exciting. I especially enjoyed the fight scene with Vi and Savika. It was amazingly animated and shows Arcane's strength of making violence feel visceral without relying on excessive gore. I really have nothing to complain about in this episode. Pretty much every scene was entertaining and gave plenty of important development that continued to further my interest in the characters and world of Arcane. I'll give it a 9.6 out of 10. Episode 6, When These Walls Come Tumbling Down. After 2 already great episodes, the season reaches yet another high point with one of the best episodes of the entire show. Every scene from start to finish is absolutely compelling and yet again introduces massive change to the setting as we know it. Victor's storyline was one of the saddest parts about this episode for me. Seeing him struggling to come to terms with his eventual death, since there's so much more he still wants to do. It makes a lot of sense why he's become so consumed by his research and wanting to get things done as quickly as possible, since he knows his time is running out. So you can completely understand why he's become so obsessed with the Hex Core, since it's the only chance he has of saving his life. But Heimerdinger doesn't see the Hex Core this way, recognizing it as the same type of magic that has caused so much death in the past. And for this reason, he says the Hex Core must be destroyed. But before Heimerdinger can get the chance to do this, Jace manages to turn the council against him by showing how Heimerdinger's way of running things is just causing more problems due to him slowing down Piltover's progress significantly, which leads to Heimerdinger being voted off the council. Not only was it a sad scene, but I really liked how you can both agree and disagree with both sides in this case. On one hand, Heimerdinger's ideals are slowing down Hex Tech's progress, meaning that it could be decades before they could actually use their power over magic to save lives, something that could be done so much sooner. But at the same time, this magic is capable of causing death and suffering, so it's understandable why some people would be reluctant to use it. And as we see later in the show, this fear from Heimerdinger is very much justified. It adds a lot of gray morality since no one is completely in the right here, and it's one of the best parts of Arcane in my opinion. We also get some interesting world building involving Zahn now that Silco is in charge, showing us an area at the bottom of a cliff that is filled with people who have become malnourished and disfigured due to taking too much of the drug Shimmer that Silco deals. One of these people being Huck, who we saw in a brief scene in the very first episode. We learned from Caitlyn's interactions with him that Huck used to know Vi years ago, but still seemed to care about her even when he couldn't bring himself to see her. But even then, he chooses to rat her out to Silco for more Shimmer. It really puts into perspective how Silco selling Shimmer has destroyed so many lives, to the point that some people were willing to betray those they care about for just a little more. The whole sequence with Vi and Jinx's reunion was so satisfying, especially due to how gut-wrenching the last scene we saw with them was. They have plenty of reasons to hate each other, but even after all they went through, they still care about each other deep down and wanted to see each other again. But this reunion is cut short when they are attacked by the Firelights. Not only did this scene give us some great action, but was where each of these characters realized how their bond will never go back to the way it was before. It was such a heartbreaking development for these two characters, but it also left me very interested in seeing more of them together now that their dynamic has changed so much. We're only 2/3 of the way through this show, yet this episode felt like a season finale, with how consistently exciting it was and how much massive plot developments occurred. It is one of the best episodes of the show and yet again shows why Arcane is such an amazing series. I'll give it a 9.9 out of 10. Episode 7, The Boy Savior. You'd think the show might slow down a bit after reaching a significant climax in the previous episode, yet they managed to maintain this level of quality to give us yet another amazing episode. We see Jace yet again struggling to figure out the right thing to do when faced with the idea that Hex Tech might need to be used to build weapons in order to wage war with Zahn. But the standout part of this episode was definitely Echo, who after this single episode went from a character with close to no screen time into one of the best characters in the show. Arcane had a lot of information to give us about Echo's character, especially considering how little we've seen of him up until this point. And they managed to deliver it all amazingly through the strong characterization and storytelling you can expect from this show. We learn how he was forced to grow up quickly so he could be able to help the many people of Zaun who were negatively affected by Silco's rule. On the surface level, he seems like such a different person, but we get plenty of moments to show that he's still the same person, and just like Vi, still hasn't completely moved on from what happened before the time skip. Something that shows in what is possibly the best fight of Arcane, Jinx versus Echo. Not only was it exciting and beautifully animated, but had some of the show's best visual storytelling, giving us such a good understanding of Echo and his relationship to Jinx with barely any dialogue. We see at the start of this fight how he seems like he doesn't want to fight Jinx, but he knows that she's changed and that he has to go through with this. But at the end, when Jinx is at her most vulnerable, Echo can't bring himself to deliver the finishing blow, that no matter how much he tries to trick himself or others, he still cares about Jinx, even knowing how much of a terrible person she has become. It's incredible how a fight can be this exciting, yet at the same time be so dense with amazing characterization that shows us so much about these characters. There's really no other fight in this show that comes close in that regard, and for that reason I consider it to be one of the best. Although I don't think it's overall as good as some of the show's best episodes, it definitely has some of the best scenes and character development in all of Arcane, and for that I'll give it a 9.8 out of 10. Episode 8, Oil and Water. Just when I thought this show couldn't impress me even more than it already has, it gives us yet another phenomenal episode. We get introduced to Mel's mother Ambessa, whose role in the story I appreciate much more on rewatch. Even if she isn't the most likable character, she was kind of right about everything, having a better understanding of the situation with Zaun and Piltover than many of those involved. The scene with Jinx undergoing the process to save her life was really unsettling. The animation and voice acting doing such a good job at depicting how painful this process is, making this scene very uncomfortable in the best way. And due to part of the process having her taking the drug Shimmer, it's clear that she's going to be a much bigger threat due to this plus her already unstable mental state. Despite having a smaller role in the overall episode, Victor's storyline was yet again one of the most powerful for me. We've seen in the past few episodes how much he has been held back by his serious health conditions, so to see him finally overcome this thanks to the Hex Core and be able to properly run for the first time in his life was an incredibly beautiful scene. But it's right after this scene where we get one of the most heartbreaking, where Victor attempting to obtain power from the Hex Core for the second time unintentionally leads to the death of his assistant, Sky. It's a very short scene, yet it managed to be such a gut punch that once again showed how tragic this story is. Heimerdinger mentioned earlier in the show how dangerous the Hex Core can be, and it's in this episode where we get an idea of how dangerous this is in such a heartbreaking way. We also see Vi and Jace join forces in order to stop Silco's Shimmer production, which made for some great moments with these two characters that I never would have expected to work together. The best moment with these two characters for me being their fight with the chem tanks in the Shimmer production facility, which is a serious contender for the best fight scene in Arcane. Although not as narratively impressive as Jinx vs. Echo, it makes up for it with stunning animation and choreography. And the way it ended was so shocking and tragic, where Jace accidentally kills a child while firing his weapon at the chem tanks. It once again shows how cruel this conflict can be, and shows Jace how terrible the consequences of war will be on both sides, something that will have a massive impact on his character. I'm not sure what else I can say about this episode. It yet again has everything I could want from an Arcane episode, and perfectly shows why this is one of the best shows in recent years. I'll give it a 9.9 out of 10. Episode 9. The Monster You Created. I had no idea how this show could possibly top the phenomenal third episode, but somehow the season finale managed to do just that, not only giving us my favorite episode of Arcane, but one of my favorite television episodes of all time. It's less action-packed than a lot of other Arcane episodes, but makes up for it with its consistently incredible storytelling and character writing. So much aspects that the show does amazingly are on display here, and it manages to tie up so many storylines in such a tragic yet breathtaking way, while still leaving enough room for there to be a second season. Right at the start, we see the aftermath of Jace accidentally killing an Undercity child, which leaves him very distraught. Him realizing how much suffering of innocent people would be caused if there was a war between Piltover and Zaun. And if only he realized this sooner, maybe this child wouldn't have died. We also see Victor face the reality that his experiments were responsible for the death of Skye, as he realizes from her papers was one of the few people in his life who appreciated him for who he is. It's incredibly heartbreaking to see him unintentionally cause something so terrible. And both of these heartbreaking moments led up to the phenomenal scene where Jace and Victor meet up. We see them coming to terms with how their ambitions to bring scientific advancements have brought so much pain to themselves and others, choosing to destroy the Hex Core before it causes even more suffering. It's sad to know that this will be getting rid of their only chance to save Victor's life, but even if it was too late to undo what they've done, they chose to do the right thing in the end. We also see the conclusion of Silco's character arc, and after this episode, he is one of, if not my favorite characters of Arcane. We see him finally have the opportunity to secure Zaun's independence, something he was willing to do so many terrible things to achieve. But the only way to do so is give Jinx up to the Council as punishment for her crimes. It was pretty sad to see Silco so close to achieving his goals, yet he would never be able to achieve them since he cares about Jinx too much to give her up. And not long after this, we get the scene where Jinx has captured Vi, Caitlyn, and Silco, which had me on the edge of my seat from start to finish. It genuinely felt like one of these characters could die at any moment, and I can recall few times where I felt this nervous about characters in a TV show. It was one of the most compelling scenes of the show for me, and it isn't even the best part of this episode in my opinion. At the end of this scene, we see Jinx in an enraged state kill Silco, which was so heartbreaking to watch. We see in the show before that although their relationship is twisted in some ways, they genuinely care about each other and were the only people in each other's lives that they could truly rely on. Their relationship was so well executed in this show, and it made this development all the more devastating. We then get a monologue from Jinx, which was such a massive moment for her character. We see how Jinx is painfully aware of the fact that things will never go back to normal, and that she will never be the same person she once was at the beginning of the show. Jinx wants Vi to love her for who she is, but she feels that Vi only loves her for the person she used to be. It's in this scene where she's at her most lonely, but it was also where she finally accepts herself for who she is. And if all this phenomenal character development wasn't enough, we get one of the most jaw-dropping cliffhangers I have ever seen, where Jinx fires her rocket launcher at the council building, which will most likely lead to the deaths of the entire council. One of the most heartbreaking parts about this episode was how everything we've seen in this show to some extent was building up to this one moment of absolute tragedy. We could completely understand what drove Jinx to do this. Silka was so close to securing Zaun's independence, but by Jace telling him to give up Jinx, he had no choice but to give up on this vital opportunity in order to protect the one he cared about the most. And for this reason, he died before he could ever achieve his goals. And for this reason, Jinx chooses to attack the Council in an act of revenge. But as we see from the Council's perspective, they were just about to grant independence to Zaun, but Jinx blowing up their building would mean that this chance would probably be gone forever. Even in the unlikely event that the Council survives, this act of terrorism will just perpetuate this never-ending cycle of violence and tragedy. It was such a bleak yet breathtaking way to end this season, and left me extremely desperate to see a season 2. This episode was nothing short of a phenomenal ending to this phenomenal season of television. So many incredible moments from start to finish, amazing development for so many of its characters, and one of the most impactful endings I will ever see. If this isn't a perfect 10, I don't know what is. Arcane was such a pleasant surprise for me. I was skeptical about whether I'd end up liking it or not, but it ended up becoming one of my favorite shows of all time, and only gets better with every rewatch. In only 9 episodes, the team of this show has crafted one of the most compelling stories I have ever seen, and has left such a significant emotional impact on me in such a short runtime. I have no idea where this show could possibly go from here, but regardless, I'm extremely excited to see where it goes. And I have faith that wherever it does go, it will be something truly special.